The beeping was the only sound I remember. Not my son's voice, not my daughter-in-law's hurried footsteps down a hospital hallway. Just the steady, indifferent rhythm of a machine that had no idea it was the only thing keeping me company. I had been grocery shopping when it happened, not doing anything dramatic or brave. Just reaching for a can of tomato soup on the bottom shelf of aisle 7 when my left arm went numb and the floor came up to meet me faster than I could understand what was happening. The woman who found me said I knocked over an entire display of canned goods on the way down. She said I scared her half to death. I told her later, when I could finally talk, that she had no idea how accurate that description was. My name is Dorothy. I am 68 years old. I taught 4th grade for 31 years at the same elementary school 3 miles from the house where I raised my son Marcus. I know every crack in the sidewalk on my street. I know which neighbors leave their porch lights on and which ones don't. I know the name of the mail carrier's dog. I thought I knew my own family, too. I was wrong about that last part. The paramedics told me later that I had a major cardiac event. That was the phrase they used. A major cardiac event. Like my heart had decided to host something significant without consulting me first. The surgery took 4 hours. I was unconscious for most of 2 days afterward, drifting in and out of something that felt less like sleep and more like being submerged in warm, dark water. When I finally opened my eyes for real and stayed open, the first face I saw belonged to a nurse named Gloria, who had kind eyes and a no-nonsense ponytail, and who squeezed my hand and said, "There she is." And I thought, surely Marcus is right behind her. Surely he is parking the car or getting coffee from the vending machine down the hall. Surely he is just outside the door, pacing the way he always did when he was worried, the same way he paced before his college entrance exams, before his wedding, before his daughter was born. I asked Gloria where my son was. She paused just a half-second too long before she smiled and said, "Let's get the doctor in here first." That pause told me everything, even if I wasn't ready to hear it. The doctor, a calm man named Dr. Okafor, who spoke in measured sentences and never seemed rushed even when the hallway outside was chaos, sat down across from me and explained what had happened to my body. He used words I half understood and drew a little diagram on a notepad. He was thorough and patient and kind. And then, when he was done explaining my heart, he said something that cracked mine open in a different way entirely. He told me his office had been trying to reach my son since I arrived. He said they had called 31 times over the first 24 hours. 31 times. He said the emergency contact form I had filled out 2 years ago at my annual physical listed Marcus as my primary contact and his wife, Renee, as secondary. He said they had called both numbers. He said they had left voicemails, sent texts to the number on file, even called the landline listed on my chart that I had honestly forgotten I still had. No one answered. No one called back. I did not cry in front of Dr. Okafor. I have my pride. But I did ask him to please excuse me for a moment, and I turned my face toward the window, and I looked at the gray January sky outside, and I thought about 31 phone calls going out into the world and dissolving into silence. I thought about Marcus at 7 years old, running a fever of 103, and me sitting on the edge of his bed all night with a cold cloth and a thermometer and the kind of focused, terrified love that only a mother in a dark room with a sick child understands. I thought about 31 calls. Then I turned back and told Dr. Okafor I was ready to discuss next steps. Renee had called me dramatic before. That was the word she used about 18 months earlier when I mentioned that Marcus had not come to Thanksgiving. She said I had expectations that weren't realistic for people with busy lives. She said this at my own kitchen table, drinking coffee from my good mugs, and she said it with the kind of calm certainty that people use when they have been rehearsing something for a while. Marcus had nodded. He had been nodding at Renee for about 6 years by that point. Not the nod of a man who agreed. The nod of a man who had decided that agreement was easier than the alternative. I understood on some level. Renee was not a bad person. She was just a person who had decided, early in their marriage, that her husband's family of origin was a problem to be managed rather than people to be loved. She had her reasons. I am sure some of them were even valid. But 31 unanswered calls while I was unconscious after heart surgery did not feel like a misunderstanding about holiday expectations. It felt like something else entirely. I was in the hospital for 9 days. Marcus came on day 4. He came alone, without Renee, and he sat in the chair beside my bed, and he looked at his hands a lot, and he said he was sorry he hadn't come sooner. He said things had been complicated. He said Renee had been dealing with something with her mother, and the kids had activities, and he hadn't seen the missed calls right away. 31 calls. He hadn't seen them right away. I looked at my son, this man with my father's forehead and my mother's eyes, this person I had shaped my entire adult life around, and I smiled at him, and I said I was glad he came. Because I was. And because I am 68 years old, and I have buried a husband and a best friend and 2 parents, and I know that some things, once said aloud, cannot be unsaid, and I was not yet sure which category this conversation belonged to. He stayed for 40 minutes. He hugged me carefully when he left, the way you hug someone fragile. Then he went back to his life. And I lay there in my hospital bed and I thought very carefully about mine. Here is what I did not know when I came home from the hospital, that my neighbor, Patrice, had been watering my houseplants. Patrice lives 3 houses down. She is 62, recently widowed, and we have the kind of neighborhood friendship that involves waving from driveways and exchanging baked goods at Christmas and occasionally sitting on each other's porches when the evenings are good. We are not what I would have called close. We were friendly in the way that decent neighbors are friendly, warm without being intimate. But when I pulled into my driveway in the medical transport van on a Tuesday morning in January, Patrice was standing on my porch with a casserole dish and a key that she had apparently gotten from my emergency lockbox, the code to which I had given her 2 years ago and promptly forgotten about. She said, "I heard the ambulance. I watched your house. I hope that's okay." I stood on my own front porch, still slow and careful in my movements, still carrying the particular exhaustion of someone whose chest had been opened and closed again, and I looked at this woman I had waved to from driveways for 11 years, and I started to cry. Not delicately, the ugly kind, the kind that surprised me. Patrice put the casserole down on the porch railing and hugged me like I was not fragile at all. She had done more than water my plants. She had collected my mail. She had called the utility company when she noticed my porch light had gone out, figuring it was a billing issue since no one had been home. She had at some point also called the hospital to ask about my status, been told they couldn't release information, and then called every day anyway just to say she was checking. The nurses apparently knew her by name. Over the next several weeks, Patrice became the person who drove me to my cardiac follow-up appointments. Not because I asked the first time, she simply appeared at my door at 8:15 on a Thursday morning and said, "Your appointment's at 9. I looked it up on the fridge calendar when I watered the ferns. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you say something obvious. I did not argue. I was too tired to argue, and also I did not want to. Marcus called every few days. The calls were short. He asked how I was feeling, and I said I was improving, and he said that was good, and there were pauses in the conversation that neither of us knew how to fill. Renee sent a fruit basket with a card signed by both of them. It arrived 2 weeks after I got home. The card said, "Wishing you a speedy recovery," in the generic pre-printed font of something purchased from a gift website. I set it on the counter next to the flowers Patrice had brought from her own garden, cut and arranged in one of my vases that she had found in the cabinet without having to ask. One evening, about 6 weeks after I came home, Patrice and I were sitting on my back porch with tea and the kind of quiet that had become comfortable between us. She said, without preamble, "Do you want to talk about your son?" I looked at the yard for a long time. Then I said, "He didn't answer the calls." "I know," she said. "I heard them calling his number from the hallway when I went to the hospital that first day." I turned to look at her. "You went to the hospital?" "Of course I did," she said, as if this were obvious, as if showing up for a neighbor she barely knew in a medical crisis were the most natural thing in the world. "You were unconscious. Someone had to be there." I set down my tea very carefully. I am not a woman who falls apart easily. I raised a child mostly alone after my husband Raymond passed when Marcus was 14. I managed 31 years of classrooms and parent-teacher conferences and school board budget cuts. I am not easily undone, but sitting on my back porch with this woman who had shown up, repeatedly and without being asked, while my own son had sent a fruit basket, I felt something in me shift. Not break, shift. The way a house settles and some things that were crooked become level, And some things that felt solid develop a crack you can't unsee. I want to be fair to Marcus. That is important to me, even now. He is not a cruel man. He is a man who made a series of small choices over a long period of time, and each small choice seemed manageable on its own, and then one day, there were 31 unanswered calls and a fruit basket delivered 2 weeks late, and the accumulation of all those small choices had become something large and irreversible, without him ever having made one dramatic, obvious decision to let me go. I think he loved me. I think he still does. In the way that people love the things they neglect with guilt that gets converted over time into distance. What changed for me was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. What changed was clarity. I had spent the last several years quietly shrinking my needs, apologizing for wanting to see my grandchildren more often, accepting last-minute cancellations with cheerful understanding, framing my own hurt feelings as expectations that weren't realistic for people with busy lives, the way Renee had taught me to frame them. I had been so focused on not being a burden that I had made myself invisible, and when I became truly invisible, unconscious in a hospital, unable to manage my own needs and all the calls went unanswered. That told me something. I called my attorney in March. His name is Gerald, and he has handled my affairs since Raymond died, and he is the kind of attorney who speaks plainly and does not charge you for phone calls under 10 minutes. I told him I needed to revisit my will. He said, "Is everything all right, Dorothy?" I said, "Everything is becoming clearer." He didn't ask me to explain. That is what I have always liked about Gerald. I had structured everything for Marcus. The house, the savings, Raymond's life insurance money that I had never touched, because touching it had always felt like acknowledging that Raymond was really gone in a way I was not ready to accept. There was also the settlement money from when I slipped on a wet floor at the grocery store 4 years ago and fractured my wrist, $85,000 that I had put in a separate account and never quite figured out what to do with. Everything had been set aside and organized with Marcus's name on it, because he was my son, and because that is what you do for your children. I told Gerald I wanted to make some changes. I thought about what Patrice had said when I thanked her once, too effusively, for everything she had done. She had waved her hand and said, "Dorothy, you don't thank people for being decent." And then, after a pause, "But you could thank me by letting me take you to that botanical garden next month when your energy is back. I've been meaning to go for 2 years, and I never want to go alone." I had laughed. Real laughter. The kind that still surprised me a little, that I hadn't expected to have access to so soon. I left the house to Marcus. I want to be honest, I did not cut him out entirely. He is still my son. The house is the house he grew up in, and I cannot bring myself to erase that history, and I think Raymond would not have wanted me to. But the savings account, the life insurance money I had been holding on to for 22 years, and the $85,000, I divided those differently. I set up a trust for my grandchildren, specifically structured so that the money could only be used for their education and could not be accessed by their parents until the children were adults. I left a portion to my church, and I left a meaningful amount to Patrice, with a letter explaining that it was not charity, but the kind of acknowledgement that our culture has no good word for. The recognition of someone who showed up when showing up was the whole of what mattered. Gerald made no comment on any of this. He simply drafted the documents and sent them for my signature and told me to call if I had questions. I signed them on a Wednesday afternoon in April, 3 months after the ambulance took me away from aisle 7 and my knocked-over display of tomato soup cans. I want to tell you about the phone call. In June, Patrice and I took a long weekend trip to visit her sister in Savannah. It was the first trip I had taken since before Raymond died, and I had forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere unfamiliar in a way that felt like discovery rather than displacement. We walked along the waterfront and ate at a restaurant with outdoor seating and drank sweet tea and talked about everything and nothing, and I slept better in that unfamiliar bed than I had in my own home in months. I had my phone on the nightstand. On the second evening, while Patrice was in the shower and I was sitting by the window watching the light change over the rooftops, Marcus called. I looked at his name on the screen for a moment. Then I answered. He did not sound angry. He sounded uncertain, which was somehow harder to listen to. He said that Renee had mentioned something, that she had run into Gerald's paralegal at a community event. Small towns have their own particular geography of information, and that certain things had come up in conversation that had led Renee to ask Gerald directly about the status of certain documents. And Gerald, to his absolute credit, had told her politely that he was not in a position to discuss his client's private affairs. Marcus said he just wanted to understand what was happening. I watched the light on the Savannah rooftops, and I thought about what to say. I said, "Do you remember when I came home from the hospital in January?" He said he did. I said, "Do you remember what day you came to visit?" A pause. "It was I came as soon as I could." "Day 4, I said. "It was day 4. Another pause. I said, "They called you 31 times, Marcus. I'm not telling you that to hurt you. I'm telling you because I think you might not have understood what those 31 calls meant to me when I found out about them. I was unconscious and I was alone, and 31 calls went out into the world with my name on them, and none of them came back." The line was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Mom, I don't know what to say." I said, "I know." He said, "Can we talk about the will?" Renee is Marcus. My voice was gentle. I meant it to be gentle. I have no interest in being cruel to my son. The decisions I've made about my affairs are mine to make. I've taken care of you. The house is yours. Your children's futures are protected. What I've changed is the part that reflects what I've learned about who shows up. He was quiet again, and then he said something that I was not expecting. He said, "I know I haven't been there enough. I know that. It got complicated, and I didn't know how to." He stopped. "I'm sorry, Mom. I mean that." I believed him. I told him I loved him. Because I do. I told him that love and consequences were not opposites, that you could love someone and still let the truth of what happened be the truth of what happened without rewriting it into something softer just because the rewriting would be more comfortable. He didn't argue. I don't know if that was growth or shock or simply not having the words. Maybe it doesn't matter which. We talked for a little while longer. Ordinary talk. The kind that doesn't carry the weight of the big things but happens around them. He told me about my granddaughter's school play. I told him about Savannah. When we hung up, I sat by the window for a long time. Patrice came out of the shower with her hair in a towel and found me there and said, "Everything okay?" I thought about 31 calls. I thought about a fruit basket with a pre-printed card. I thought about ferns watered in my absence, and a key kept safe, and a woman appearing on my porch with a casserole and no announcement. I thought about what Dr. Okafor had said to me near the end of my stay when I was well enough to walk the hallway, that the heart is a remarkably resilient organ, that it heals in ways that still surprise medicine, that what looks irreparable is often not. I thought he was talking about the surgery. I think now he might have been talking about something else entirely. I looked at Patrice and I said, "Everything is becoming very clear." She sat down across from me and poured 2 glasses from the bottle of wine her sister had sent up with us and handed one to me. Outside, the Savannah evening was warm and unhurried, and the light was doing something extraordinary on the old brick buildings, and I was 68 years old, and I had survived something that could have ended me. And I was in a city I had never visited before with a woman who had shown up when showing up was everything. I raised my glass. She raised hers. We did not say anything. We did not need to. If you are watching this and you are sitting with something heavy, a child who does not call, a family member who was absent when you needed them most, the particular grief of realizing that someone you built your life around has been building something different, I want you to know that the story is not over at the hard part. I know it feels like it is. I know what it feels like to lie in a hospital bed in the dark and do the math on who came and who didn't. But I also know what it feels like to sit on a back porch with someone who shows up, drinking tea in the kind of quiet that costs nothing and is worth everything. Your heart is more resilient than you think. So are you.